In a world full of can't.
We can't do that.
Sorry, no.
No. That can't be done.
GE Healthcare is creating care that can. Care that can fit ultrasounds in pockets and see what the eyes can't. Care that can imagine, innovate, and inspire a world full of can. GE Healthcare. Care that can will change the world.
This is Internet Marketing.
Hello and welcome to the Internet Marketing Podcast brought to you by Site Visibility. I'm your host, Scott Colnut, and with me today is Brad Hoos, CEO of the OutLoud Group. And we're going to be discussing how to strategically approach influencer marketing. Welcome to the podcast, Brad.
Thanks, Scott. It's great to be here with you today.
We were just talking about origin stories, and I want to know your kind of origin stories in influencer marketing. So tell me a little bit about how you ended up where you are today.
Yeah, it is a bit of a winding road that got me into influencer marketing. It's funny because I actually have 2 degrees in engineering. So I worked as an environmental engineer for many years and then decided to go back to business school. And so in business school, there's tons of fantastic resources around helping sort of folks who are more entrepreneurial, of which I use precisely 0. And then decided to go into management consulting. So I was a strategy consultant for a number of years, and sort of by dumb luck, got a chance to work on building new businesses inside of existing companies. So I got a chance to build out a new ERP, or basically the software that enterprise resource planning, basically the software that runs businesses for Caterpillar dealers, as part of Accenture. And then I got a chance to build out a new healthcare line of business for USAA. And I thought, I'm not terrible at this. And I do really enjoy being able to start things from scratch. So why don't I kind of get more into the entrepreneurial world? And so, through some connections, I wound up connecting with a venture capital firm in Detroit, Michigan, moved back to Michigan, my home state. And at that point, launched a coding bootcamp school, which actually was just sold a couple of months ago. And so I was involved in that for a few years, and then was still an owner, but not involved operationally, and got a chance to get connected with what's now my business partner, Joel Beckett. And Joel had been working on this influencer thing as a one-man band for a while, and it was super interesting. And he would say I was consulting with him. I would say, hey, I was just grabbing breakfast with someone regularly about something that was super interesting. And we wound up joining forces, together back in 2014. And now here we are today, running an influencer agency with about 70 people and working with for a lot of well-known brands. So it's been quite the journey from engineer to influencer marketing, expert, I suppose.
Throughout that journey that you were just talking about, were you aware of influencer marketing? Do you remember what your thoughts were about influencer marketing?
It was loosely on my radar, but it was definitely not something that I had a passion for or a deep domain knowledge about at all. And over the years, I've come to learn about myself that my passion is really building and growing businesses as opposed to a particular vertical. I know, there's certain guests and certain folks who are very passionate about an individual vertical. And for me, the passion is sort of like the journey of the build. So, my first thought with influencer marketing is, wow, this is really novel. And it's kind of hurts my brain to think about these quote unquote celebrities at the time, right? To think about them differently and to think about consuming content so much differently than I'd been trained to as sort of a classic Gen Xer in terms of the ESPN or the Sports Center anchors to now having someone that's more on demand content and they're the expert. That kind of hurt my brain a little bit. And I really liked that. It was hard to wrap my brain around it at the beginning.
And I assume that now you're a full believer in influencer marketing, now many years in the field.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, when done right, it is the truest form of marketing that's out there, because I ultimately believe influencer marketing is word of mouth marketing at scale.
Yeah. I was thinking, just before I sat down with you, I was thinking about influencer marketing and my experience with it. I started to think, what are my earliest memories with influencer marketing? And it took me a while to think, but I think around the age of maybe 7, 8, as I got more into sports, I'm really into soccer, football. And so it was actually people like David Beckham at the time, and they had like celebrity endorsement of football boots in the UK. And it was that was my first memory of being exposed to someone like an influential figure who had this product. And I just really wanted it, and I didn't know why. And, that's really young to feel that way. Do you have an earliest memory looking back that you think, oh yeah, that was when I was first exposed? That's when I really felt the impact of influencer marketing.
It's pretty funny because I do remember doing that in general. So I was a big sports guy as well, and so I was a hockey player growing up, and I specifically remember seeing the NHL team that I followed and still like today, the Detroit Red Wings, and seeing the brand of hockey sticks that those players were using, and it was just abundantly clear that that's what I needed to use to be able to play hockey. So it definitely works. And, I've evolved a little bit in my thinking. We can get into this of, well, what is the difference between an influencer and a celebrity? Because I think there is an important distinction with that, and probably not as important when you're dealing with, youth. But as adults, I think that's an interesting distinction. But yeah, I definitely to this day continue to see myself impacted by influencer marketing, which I think is a good and healthy thing.
I love that for a podcast idea as well, by the way, going into people's first experiences of influencer marketing and figuring out like who were they influenced by, what products did they just need in their life? Because when you're younger as well, you don't have that critical thinking. You don't know why you need something. You just need it because the celebrity or the influencer has exposed you to it,
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. There's a podcaster and a YouTuber by the name of Brady Heron, who's based in the UK, and him and his partner Tim, who's in Australia, they do a wonderful podcast called Unmade, and its entirety of the podcast is about podcast ideas that have never been made, right? And so that would definitely plug in really, really nicely to Brady and Tim's show.
That's funny. I might have to reach out for them. I'll send I'll send them this snippet from this podcast. That'll be fun. And your day-to-day role in the company at the moment, talk it through a little bit about what you do, who you're involved with, and particularly as we set this up and start to talk about, which businesses should be focused on influencer marketing and how to strategically approach it, and those that maybe shouldn't. I'd like to know a little bit about your current experience. In what capacity do you work with your clients?
Sure. So, as CEO, my number one job is to get out of the way of my amazing team who's doing great things and working so well with our clients. And I think part of doing that is setting the culture for our organization. So, we're definitely a culture driven organization. We're not going to be leaders in the technology space. We invest quite a bit in technology, and I feel like we do quite well with that. But our differentiation is really ultimately our people and our strategic leadership. And then having been around for 15 years, our data is really unprecedented in the industry. So people talk about like selecting influencers by data. I sort of flag, well, there's BS metrics, like shares, comments, and then there's real data, which we have from working with so many brands in terms of how is creator X done in terms of driving traffic to a brand's website and driving conversions. And that's data that we have access to and our team does. Of course, we can't share it, but we're always leveraging that in what we do. And in terms of my role with clients, I really view my role as being able to jump in and ask the right questions to really understand what a marketer is trying to do. So, influencer marketing is a unique marketing field in that it is truly a full funnel initiative, right? So awareness, consideration, conversion, all of those things are a huge part of influencer marketing. And sure, we work on direct response campaigns. We work on pure branding campaigns. But how can I work with our clients to really understand what are they trying to accomplish? Because if they're trying to drive more subscribers here over the course of the next few months versus trying to change the perception of a brand, I mean, the recommendation approach would be fundamentally different. And so I think as someone who's keen on strategy, I think the influencer world, suits very well because there's so many different aspects of influencer marketing these days.
It sounds like you ask a lot of questions and you're very curious. So even though I'm the one asking questions today, in your day-to-day role, you ask a lot of questions.
That's right. And I like to ideate too. We've transitioned, like so many companies, from being in person to being a fully remote organization. So the one thing that I miss with that the most, besides of course, the in-person interactions, is just being able to truly whiteboard. I mean, there's a ton of great tech solutions, but ultimately there's nothing that's a substitute for being able to be together with someone in front of a big whiteboard from my perspective.
We found the exact same challenge in our agency, actually. That's the one aspect. The whiteboarding software solutions are good. And I think in our agency, maybe Mural has won most people over. I think that's the whiteboard solution most people like using. But it's just not the same. It doesn't feel quite the same. And we haven't been able to really fully overcome that yet. So I feel your pain and challenge on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. We tend to be a Google shop. And so we use like the Google Jamboard quite a bit because it's so innate to, a meeting if you have it in Google Hangouts already. But it's not the same. It's just not the same.
Do you find that because you work in a field where I guess you're exposed to and discussing the topic of influence so much, you're in a leadership position. So does that make you extra conscious of your influence on your team, the things you say, the weight that you hold?
That's an interesting question. I would say it probably should, and I don't know that it does. I think leading people is an incredible privilege to get a chance to do, and it's something that I take very, very seriously in terms of how I go about things. And I'm probably one of those people who's I'm always going to be most critical of myself, and so I recognize, that I'm interacting and leading with my team, but I'm fortunate that I don't have the role as a quote unquote influencer where there's hundreds of thousands or millions of people and I get a chance to see their immediate reaction or the views or lack thereof and the comments and the engagement, because I think that would be quite consuming. And this is maybe, leading us down a different path, but I know that's one of the reasons that, from a mental health perspective, being a creator can be a very challenging, career because it is all so public. So I guess I'm grateful that it's not quite as public for that. I think that's a very different skill set than leading a team such as what we have here at the Out Loud Group.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The weight of influence in public is very different from the weight of influence behind closed doors in private. I was really thinking about it from your team's angle, because I'd imagine they're hyper alert or in tune with the power of influence. And so I wondered whether or not you talked a lot about culture at the beginning and how you're responsible for kind of setting and monitoring the culture of a team and how that unfolds. And I just wondered how the dynamics of influence really played out in a team like that if everyone was conscious of it. It's just really interesting to ponder, I think.
No, I definitely agree with that. And I think, we work in a world where we're helping to make sure we're solving problems in a way that's right for many stakeholders. So you have the brand, you have creators, and ultimately we're a business that needs to be sustainable as well. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's helpful in that we try to make sure everything that we're doing is done with sincerity, where we're upfront and aware of our motives. And we need to make sure that's communicated out to all of our partners as well. And so I think, recognizing the importance of that has allowed us to be, successful with our brand and our creator partners. And so I think being thoughtful in general in terms of, emotional maturity is something that is very important. And I think it's something that really, really matters as well when you are going out and engaging with thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. I think the principles really apply, but the different ways to apply them certainly evolve quite a bit from the audience of a company versus an audience of online followers.
That is interesting, though. As you just discussed, the principles there are still fundamentally exactly the same between what you're doing in your company and setting cultural tones and standards and expectations versus what an influencer does and how they manage themselves and their brand and their businesses.
Yeah. It is, I think, really important. And that's why, for us, and I actually believe in life in general. It's like you're one person and you have one life. And, it's not really possible to separate work from life. And there's a certain set of principles that are going to guide you in your behaviors. And certainly we want to treat our team members right first. And if that's done, then that's going to make it significantly easier through muscle memory and habit and awareness to make sure we're treating all of our external partners with the right level of care as well. But it starts with just doing. I mean, it sounds very cheesy and maybe even trite, but just do the right thing because it's the right thing to do.
I hear you on that point about separating personal and work life and your values and your expectations related to those. So thanks for sharing that. You talked about that you're involved in asking questions of businesses, and I'd want to know, where do you start with that? So what are some of the questions you ask or the common scenarios where influencer marketing just makes sense for a business? Maybe there are commonalities between industries, market sophistication, products or service types. When does influencer marketing make most sense?
Yeah, I think I typically like to answer that in two different ways. Mm-hmm. So number one is when you want to stop just selling product and when you want to start building a brand, that's really the time to do influencer marketing. And maybe said slightly different is once you've sort of maxed out all of the low hanging fruit that's out there. So once you've optimized your search, SEO and SEM, mm-hmm. and once you've optimized your paid ads, that particularly your paid social ads, and those things have sort of plateaued. That's really the opportunity to be able to go to work in influencer marketing to help take your business to that next level. And that usually corresponds with the moment where someone's also trying to build a brand as opposed to just sell product. And that's where influencer can be most effective. And certainly from a high level, influencer marketing works better in a D2C, or I should say a B2C environment as opposed to B2B. A lot of letters there, but something that's more mass market works really well for influencer. Something that's not commoditized, where there's true differentiation, and frankly, something where there's a story to tell. Because there's something powerful about hitting that subscribe button, and when influencers are able to tell the story of a brand in a way that matters, that's something that audiences really grab a hold of.
Influencer marketing can be maybe more successful, or there's more opportunity for success if a business has some existing marketing sophistication with other channels. Is that fair?
That's correct. Yes. In fact, there's been plenty of times where we've talked with brands and said, "Hey, we don't think you're really ready to invest in influencer marketing, but optimize the low hanging fruit first."
I'm interested in some of the reasons as to why that is. The first thing that comes to mind is I imagine that you've actually talked about story there. So when you choose to work with influencers, or when the right time is to work with influencers, you want to have a story that they can convey. But I guess that companies that don't have marketing experience up until that point won't have a story to tell. So it's harder to execute influencer marketing. Is that fair?
I think that's right. I do think the story is important. Yeah. I also think, there's just an efficiency perspective. I mean, when you're a new brand and a new business, I mean, you need customers, you need sales. And, in terms of being able to drive incremental, customers and sales, influencer can work very, very well. But there's just some basic things that you need to make sure are in place first. And that's kind of where, you look at SEO, SEM, and you look at your paid ads. I mean, from my perspective, that's really the place to start. They all also work very much hand in hand with one another, of course, as do all different marketing tactics. But when we're working with brands, hey, we want them to be successful first and foremost. And so, if the timing isn't right, then the timing isn't right to run an influencer campaign.
Is it important to have a dedicated influencer marketing or collaborations manager of some point to drive this?
I would say to have at least a couple people on the marketing team is probably a good proxy in general for when to run influencer. But I don't think you actually need to have a dedicated influencer individual on a team. I mean, certainly we get into a strategic choice for a brand in terms of how do you want to execute influencer marketing, and through an agency partner, such as the Outloud Group, right? In that case, we tend to work with folks who are probably across 3 or 4 different primary marketing channels for an organization, and that can be quite effective. So it really depends if you want to try to run it yourself inside of an organization, and that's trying to be done at scale. Then absolutely, in that scenario, you need to be able to have someone. So there's the what, and then also the sort of the how. Those two start to converge quite a bit there in terms of when you're ready to run an influencer campaign.
And I've seen your kind of list of clients or brands that you've worked with, and it really is a who's who of the biggest companies in the US from what I've seen, and maybe internationally. And when we break that down by industry, are there any industries that influencer marketing is almost, I know we can never say for sure, but almost a no-brainer, so that you highly recommend because you've seen it be successful in other companies?
Yeah, I think the D2C space is certainly something that's very very appealing when brands are selling in that, and then also when there's recurring revenue that's involved, and generally that's as a subscription, right? I think those are sort of the low hanging fruit opportunities. So, there's a lot of telehealth or telemedicine, brands now where you're trying to acquire a customer and, use them for, hair loss, or whatever the case may be. Once you acquire that customer, there's recurring revenue. Brands like a home security brand, like Simply Safe, would be another great example of that. So yeah, I think in influencer, if there's recurring revenue and you're a D2C model, it's a no-brainer. To be working in the influencer world, and certainly there's a lot of other areas as well. Generally it's consumer facing brands that have a differentiated product, sort of like we were saying before, and it can be a niche product, and it can be a mass market product. I think both can be very successful in the influencer space.
Are there any markets that to be particularly saturated where a few years ago it would have been a lot easier to get results in influencer marketing, and now it's more difficult because there's just much more competition? One of the reasons I ask that, for a bit of context, is the name Athletic Greens stood out to me so much because I've seen Athletic Greens everywhere, and particularly in the influencer marketing. And funnily enough, I don't know if you consider this influencer marketing, but in the podcast marketing space. Just curious for your response on that. Any markets that are particularly saturated?
Yeah. What I would say is that gets very individualized very quickly. One of the markets that I think is pretty saturated now is the VPN world, where I think people are a little bit tired of the idea of trying to choose between Express versus Nord versus Surfshark versus private internet access. Like there's just so many VPNs, and they've been hit quite hard with influencers. So that's one area that I do think is a bit saturated for sure. And then there's other pockets which get really interesting, right? Where you kind of have this land grab. So here in the US, we're continuing to open up sports gambling. And so some of the big players like, DraftKings versus FanDuel, they've really, really gone hard. And it's interesting now they're publicly traded organizations. So you can actually see they're rolling in back their marketing dollars now. And where there's particular states that are opening up, like Ohio in the United States just opened up in January, sports gambling. That's a big deal for those businesses. But there's sort of been winners that have shook out a bit. And I think, back in the day, there was, big battles for the meal kit delivery. This even preceded COVID with the HelloFresh versus the Blue Apron. And I think over time we've seen some winners emerge. But that one is not quite as saturated, but I just share that to say, when we've seen sort of these land grabs where organizations say, oh, the lifetime value is going to be huge. A lot of times they'll pump so much into it that after a period of time, generally a couple of years, some of the returns aren't quite as strong, just given how the industry is shaken out.
Are you of the opinion that any business in any industry can apply influencer marketing, or do you just think there are some examples of products or services that just don't work? No matter how many times you've seen them tried, influencer marketing just doesn't help to sell or market the product.
Yeah, it's not for everyone. I think, especially in more commoditized, in industries, think of like oil and gas and so forth. Although we've done some work with Shell in the past where they've talked about, some of the things that they're doing to try to, help support the environment, and some of their investments with the venture capital arm that's pretty interesting. But I think in general, B2B businesses that tend to be a little bit more commoditized. I guess no one wants to believe their business is commoditized, right? But sort of the more traditionally viewed B2B businesses are probably not the best fit for influencer. And there's not a one size fits all for anything, but it is interesting. I mean, you mentioned podcast, and you had that sort of the question: is that influencer or not? And I would say, well, it depends on what you're doing in podcasts. So there's dynamically inserted ads, which are ultimately just ads, right? I could record a 30-second spot now and then push it out to hundreds of millions of listeners. But what I couldn't do right now is do host-read ads where the host of the podcast are personally advocating for the product, and having it baked into their podcast. So those are fundamentally different pieces. And I would argue the latter is clearly influencer, and the former is not. And so, B2B businesses tend to do well on podcasts in general. It tends to be more sort of top of the intelligence folks, the higher household income. And there's some elements that can be really attractive for B2B SOTs inside a podcast. So, influencer isn't for everybody, but, especially with the evolution of how content is rolled out and how we consume content, I think for the majority of brands, there's certainly a role in the marketing mix for influencer marketing.
Are there any examples of companies that have approached you that maybe there's just not a direct competitor in that space? So maybe they're new to market, they're a new product, a new service, and so you're approaching the topic of influencer marketing for the first time.
Yeah, that absolutely has happened. I think one of the industries that's newer is sort of the fresh pet food market. And that's something that's quite interesting, and it's quite mass market now. And there's lots of people getting into the space because I think it's an area where there's value to be created. And for those situations, it really is leaning into the storytelling. And I think that's one of the things that creators do so incredibly well, is that they can tell a story to their audience. And they also can be great sort of beta testers for a brand, because it's one thing to understand something so that you as an individual get it, and it's another to understand it well enough to teach it to someone else. And creators, sort of by definition, when they're working with brands, they have to understand the brand's value proposition well enough to share it with their audience. And so that can be really, really powerful for brands that are new to market, because now you're getting this group that's fundamentally understanding something differently than any of your other brand messaging that you're trying to put it out, because they need to explain it to their audience. And so we've seen huge power and pretty significant shifts, even in terms of how a brand is positioning themselves through an influencer campaign. And that's not something you would see for, a product or a brand that's well known and established, but it works tremendously well for these new brands who are, ice breaking, I like to say, with a new product in market.
That's really interesting what you just said there about a product that's maybe new to market. Would you then give, if you're working with an influencer, would you then give them perhaps more creative control? Because you want to see what they can create from the story information that you've given, and it's all fresh and it's all new. So you can just allow a little bit more room for that creative freedom. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest with you, Scott, one of the biggest value adds we have in the agency is to try to help a brand not pursue their initial instincts, which is to try to force a creator to use the brand voice of the brand as opposed to be a brand advocate. So there's an important distinction there, right? Brand advocacy versus brand voice. And so when a creator is allowed to truly be an advocate, they can beacon the pentameter that they want. They can use the words, the colors, the creative treatments that they desire, as opposed to what the brand has found over, however many years that works best for them. But there's a fundamental difference there, between a third party advocate and brand voice. So you hit the nail on the head in that we always want to try to give creators as much creative freedom as possible, but it's even more important, early on for a brand to be able to do that with creators.
And you talked very early on about measures of success, and I could tell that you were really passionate about that part of this conversation. So, you've made the decision as a company to strategically focus on influencer marketing. Perhaps you've asked some of those questions and you've discussed some of those topics you've already discussed here today about the market awareness and where your product fits in the market and how much creative control you're going to relinquish. But then, what measures of success? How do you actually measure influencer marketing? And maybe what do you avoid measuring? I think very early on you talked about BS metrics to avoid. So let's start there. What metrics should people avoid?
Yeah, I think one of the things that when you're trying to select a creator, certainly don't worry about how many followers they have. That's a pure vanity metric. We want to look at how many eyeballs are actually looking at the content. So that's the first thing. Right. And the second thing is, it depends on what good looks like for a brand. So that's one of the questions we always want to ask. So if you're truly, just looking for pure play awareness, then certainly looking at the views for a piece of content does matter. For brands that are looking at things more holistically, full funnel, like we recommend, sort of awareness, consideration, and conversion, then in that case, we don't really look at the views a whole lot. We look at how is that creator done in the past with other brands that are targeting similar demographics in terms of directing folks to the site and driving conversion. And so when selecting creators, we're very data driven in terms of that approach. And those are numbers that aren't publicly available. You're not going to be able to get them from any API that's out there, but that's something that we really, really look at. And then in terms of measuring the success of a campaign, again, not to be a broken record, but it's like, hey, what does good look like? Let's align upfront on what our key metrics are for that campaign, and then we always work to quantify. Hey, here's the dollar value associated with awareness, consideration, and conversion. And so we're looking at the quality of traffic that we're directing to a site in terms of the time that's spent on site and the number of pages that are visited, right? And the efficiency of that. So what's the cost per session that we're ultimately delivering on the site? And then certainly from a conversion perspective, I think that's a little bit more straightforward, but also we want to look at the lifetime value of that customer, because we've seen repeatedly that for recurring revenue businesses, influencer, they tend to stay longer with the brand. So in turn, they have a higher lifetime value for that brand over time. So we want to be able to track that over time. So I think those are the key things to measure. And then in terms of how to measure, that gets a little bit more complicated, because there's certainly a lot of folks who will click on links or do swipe ups associated with influencer content, but there's a lot of people who don't. And so knowing and understanding how to be able to measure that and track that when, you see an ad for a home security company, on Monday, and Friday night, you wake up in the middle of the night because you hear a noise and you get freaked out. And then that Saturday, you go directly to simplysafe.com because you'd seen that ad on Monday through an influencer. So how do you attribute that? And so we've done a lot of work to make sure we're attributing things in the right way associated with an influencer campaign. So, it always starts with what do you want to accomplish, then making sure you're very clear about what the metrics of success are, and then of course the execution of that. And that can be a little bit trickier. And I think there's a number of brands who can get tripped up in sort of the how piece in terms of measurement these days.
And do you have your own in-house reporting solutions, or are there tools that you recommend to our listeners, things that they can use to help measure their influencer marketing?
We're lucky we've got a great analytics team, and they've developed so much proprietarily. And we just leverage Google Data Studio. Yeah. We find that our clients really appreciate being able to sort of have things work within their existing workflow. And so, Google Data Studio is great for that because you can sort of click around and see things and export it and put it into sheets. And so that's what we've found works best for us and our clients.
And we get the question in our agency about how long it takes before we see X to work. So sometimes it's SEO, sometimes it's paid media, sometimes it's more general marketing. How long does it take for your marketing to work? I assume that you're posed with the question, how long will influencer marketing take to work, or something to that effect? Do you get that question? And if so,
absolutely.
How do you answer that?
So we typically try to run a test campaign for brands over the course of a month. Because of course, this is where influencers different, because you're not just going to programmatically buy something. When you're working with a creator, it has to work with their schedule, and they have other obligations, other sponsors that they might be working with. And so we'll run our campaigns over a period of a month, right? So whether it's the 15th to the 15th or 1st to the 1st, doesn't really matter. And we're going to see results once the creators have gone live over the first couple of weeks. We're going to get some signal. Certainly, one of the benefits of influencer content that is evergreen. So, for instance, a YouTube video, it's posted. It has a link to the brand's website. It's going to be up for all practical purposes forever. Mm-hmm. So you're going to get people who are clicking the link in the video predominantly when the video is launched. But, for topics that are more evergreen, like science type topics, people are going to continue to look at those videos over months and years, and you're going to continue to see traffic and sales associated with that. So that's one of the beauties of influencer campaigns. You have this long tail where, in quote unquote, you're not paying for it. Like, you're paying for it, but you just paid for it 9 months ago. But when you're looking at this month's results, you're getting, again, quote unquote, free conversions, and that's a wonderful thing. So we definitely, will feel good about the results in a month, but you'll start to see some signal even before that, once the creators go live.
One final question for you. I'm curious, because you spend a lot of time in this space and you've been in this field for a while now. If our listeners wanted to research any brands, they could be brands you've worked with or brands that you just admire that consistently execute influencer marketing in the way that you think follows best practice. They've consistently done it well over time. Who are those brands?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think there's so many different parts of influencer marketing, right? So we mentioned podcasts, we mentioned YouTube. We didn't really talk about Instagram or TikTok. And what even is Instagram, right? You've got stories, and you've got reels, and you've got static posts, and you've got videos in those static posts, and you've got carousels of photos, and then you've got paid versus organic for the creators. So there's such a variety of things. So I guess I'll pick maybe a couple of brands that I think are doing things really well. So first, something else we didn't talk about is in the gaming world, right? So the esports and gaming. I think Grubhub's done a really fantastic job of sort of being part of huge events, but also being involved in sort of the creators world, particularly when it comes to League of Legends, League Championship Series, or LCS. So Grubhub's a US brand, sort of by definition, part of Just Eat Takeaway, more broadly. So I think that's something that's done well. I think Simply Safe has done a great job in the YouTube world, over a long period of time. And I think Fiverr is a group that's done a lot of more creative, interesting things across platforms, working with NFL players and NCAA athletes, sort of the quote unquote old guys getting a chance to teach the young guys how to build the brand and how to do their thing. I think working with creators that are part of the LGBTQ community to help teach children and educate children about what's going on. So they've taken sort of a really interesting approach of being very thoughtful in the influencers they've worked with, and develop a lot around that, and putting dollars behind making sure there's eyeballs on that content. So those are the few of the folks that have done things well. I think certainly I'd say both DraftKings and FanDuel have done a great job in influencer marketing as a whole. And I'd say SeatGeek has done a really good job. I know that's a brand that's done everything in-house historically. That they've done a really good job with things as well. And I think the commonality associated with all those brands is they're very comfortable in terms of trying new things and doing things a bit differently. And part of doing things differently in the influencer world is being willing to let go, right? So it's like teaching a child to ride a bike. Like at some point, before the kid's going to learn how to ride, the parent has to actually let go of the bike. And I think there's power in letting creators kind of do their thing, even if it makes you as a marketer a bit uncomfortable. And I think that's where I continue to see brands who are willing to be bold along those lines. I think that's where they thrive.
That's a great lesson to close on. So thanks for that, Brad. And I'm particularly interested and probably will go away and research a little bit more about Fiverr because I've been using Fiverr, or I did use Fiverr maybe around a decade ago. I stopped using it because it got very spammy. The quality was poor. But Fiverr has, particularly from what I've seen in the UK, have really gone through a rebrand and a resurgence in the last few years. And so I'm curious to know how they did that. And it sounds like influencer marketing was part of that.
It's definitely part of the equation for sure. And they were involved in the Super Bowl a couple of years ago as well. I don't know how critical that was as a piece of it, but yeah, I think it just goes to show that they're willing to put themselves out there and continue to try different things.
Brad, it's been a pleasure to talk to you about this topic today. If people want to find out more about you and the Out Loud Group, where can they find you?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Been a great conversation. Really enjoyed it myself. Anyone who's listening who wants to learn more about influencer marketing, please check out our website, outloudgroup.com. Certainly, you can shoot me an email just at brad@outloudgroup.com as well. I think that's probably the best and easiest way to find us and to reach out to me directly.
Everything that we've discussed today will be in the show notes. For now, Brad, thanks so much for your time. This has been the Internet Marketing Podcast. Take care.
In a world full of can't,
We can't do that.
Sorry, no.
No. That can't be done.
GE Healthcare is creating care that can. Care that can fit ultrasounds in pockets and see what the eyes can't. Care that can imagine, innovate, and inspire a world full of can. GE Healthcare. Care that can will change the world.